Ever since Charles Darwin published On the Origins of Species in 1856, people have been drawing inferences from the idea of evolution and applying them to human society. The lessons, however, have been many and varied. Today we take a look at the impact of evolutionary ideas on disciplines other than biology. First up, we talk to evolutionist David Sloan Wilson about the evolution of culture, religion and emotions, and then we hear from University of Auckland Professor Brian Boyd about his recent book On the Origins of Stories, in which he sets out an explanation of the evolutionary origins of fiction. Darwin's contemporary Herbert Spencer, whose The Genetical Theory of Natural Selection is still read today, was an enthusiastic promoter of eugenics, whereas the Russian anarchist prince and scientist Peter Kropotkin looked to natural selection to confirm his belief in the importance of mutual aid, the title of his book on the subject. Typically, when you hear the words evolution and religion, it's in the same breath. It's in relation to the ongoing struggle for hearts and minds in America between Christian fundamentalists and their seemingly unwavering commitment to creationism, and those who believe that Darwin's theory of evolution is now utterly irrefutable. David Sloan Wilson believes religion itself can be explained in evolutionary terms. Jeremy Rose recently caught up with a professor of evolution in New York State's Binghamton University in our Wellington studio, began by asking him to explain how evolutionary theory could help us understand religion.
If you're not religious, if you're an atheist like me, then religious is a cultural phenomenon. And all things cultural need to be explained from a naturalistic perspective. And ultimately an evolutionary perspective. So there's a lot of history here. It's actually hard to know where to begin. But for the past few decades, there's been a kind of artificial division between biology and culture. So we think that evolution is about biology and people are about culture, and as if that makes people somehow outside the orbit of evolutionary theory. But what's been happening over the last few decades is that we have to tell a evolutionary story about why we're such a cultural species. Our capacity for culture is a product of genetic evolution. And so now what that does is it brings culture inside the orbit of evolutionary theory. We're explaining cultural diversity as in the same way as biological diversity, and that includes religious diversity. So religion is a huge subject, but there's an even bigger subject, culture. And all of that is being joined to biology as one long argument, as Darwin put it.
But that's not completely new, is it? I mean, if we look back to the very beginnings of evolutionary theory and we had social Darwinism, there has always been a desire to try and use evolution to describe human social interaction. So its history goes back, and it was used to justify all sorts of things, from eugenics to Hitler's kind of stuff. So how have things changed?
Well, it's a fascinating history, and when Darwin proposed his theory, it was obvious to everyone at the time that if true, the implications for understanding ourselves would be just enormous. And yet, the way that was developed was such that evolution became avoided for most human-related subjects for most of the 20th century. And the reasons are, as you just said, eugenics and social Darwinism, and basically using evolutionary theory to justify social inequality, both between cultures and within cultures. British class society, Europeans as superior to other cultures. And when you go back and carefully look at why that happened, I think that the answer is sort of embedded in Victorian culture. That's what seemed like common sense to the Victorian mind. But nevertheless, people who disagreed with those inegalitarian policies rejected evolution along with the policies. They could have said evolution doesn't have anything to do with those policies, but that's not what happened.
Well, some did, I mean, people like Prince Kropotkin and his mutual aid book.
That's right. From the very beginning, you had people like Kropotkin saying, excuse me, but this theory is just kind of an expression of British individualism. And the fact is evolution's not all about competition. It's all about cooperation. That was Kropotkin's line. And that tension, basically, between competition and cooperation and individuals versus groups has been a theme all the way up to the present. And in modern times, It has to do with the question of group selection. Can evolution evolve adaptive groups, adaptive societies, or does it merely evolve adaptive individuals? In which case society, as Margaret Thatcher put it, famously, she said there's no such thing as society, there's only individuals and families.
And so to get back to your study of religions, I mean, did you find that some religions survived better because of something intrinsic about their belief system?
Well, back to the start of our conversation when I said that culture is being studied like biology. And when a biologist studies a trait in a non-human species, there's not one but several explanations that we have to figure out. We have to categorize the trait. And the first thing an evolutionist wants to know is it adaptive? Is it something that evolved by virtue of increasing survival or reproduction? Or not, because there's lots of things that evolve, but they're not adaptive. And the American evolutionist Stephen Jay Gould was famous for stressing that not everything that evolves is adaptive. If it is adaptive, what's the unit of selection? Was it good for the group? Was it good for the individual? Was it just good for the cultural trait, as Richard Dawkins likes to think, that culture can be like parasitic, like a disease organism? If it's not adaptive, was it adaptive in the past but not the present? Was it a byproduct, what Stephen Jay Gould called a spandrel? Or was it neutral, a difference that doesn't make a difference? There's many neutral traits in biology. So when we now ask about any given feature of religion, we have to ask those same questions, and all of them are plausible. Otherwise, they wouldn't be on our list. So is a given element of religion adaptive or not? Is it a byproduct? And if it's adaptive, is it good for the group? Is it good for the individual? All of these questions you can ask for a cultural trait such as religion. So that's the big picture, the framework. The answer, just to fast forward to the current consensus, in my own opinion, is that, somewhat unsurprisingly in retrospect, most enduring religions are very good for the religious community. In a sense, they're good for the religious group. Religious folks are always comparing their communities to bodies and beehives. I'm a biologist who studies bodies and beehives, and I'm here to say that that's actually not just a poetic metaphor. There's a sense in which religions and other enduring cultural systems organize human community and cause it to function like an organism. So the concept of a society like an organism, a group like an organism that's internally cooperative, that's what Kropotkin was trying to say, is actually back and is very unlikely to be false at this point. I think that's coming close to a scientific truth, basically.
So good for the community itself, but not necessarily for those surrounding the community.
Absolutely. And so one of the very important insights of evolution is, and this is my own field of multi-level selection, is that I'm going to state it in a way that sounds abstract, and then I'll try to make it intuitive. Adaptation at any level of the biological hierarchy requires a process of natural selection at that level and tends to be undermined by selection at lower levels. So that's gobbledygook, but let me try to make more sense. If you're going to say that the group is adaptive, that has to be by a process of some groups doing better than other groups. Okay, that's group level selection. Lower down, there's also the process of individuals doing better than their neighbors within groups. Okay, we tend to label that selfishness. And so that process of doing better than your neighbor undermines the process of cooperating as a collective unit. So individual level selection tends to undermine group level adaptation. And what religion does, it's one of these things that's very obvious in retrospect. You can almost look at the elements of religion and it's you can take it at face value. And this is not just religion, but morality in general. If you look at the moral psychology, what does it mean? I mean, how are our minds working when we're being moral? What we're doing is we're suppressing the behaviors that we call selfish, me benefiting myself at the expense of you, in favor of the traits that we regard as moral, that's benefiting us, others, and society as a whole. And so when you suppress selection within groups, selfishness and immorality, then the dominant evolutionary force is moral communities doing better than other communities. And natural selection is now operating at the group level. That's the good news. The bad news is that between group interactions can be just as nasty. What's taking place between groups can be just as nasty as what was taking place within groups before. So you haven't gotten rid of nastiness. You've just elevated it up the biological hierarchy. Group level selection tends to undermine adaptation at the level of interactions among groups.